It's great to welcome to the program today Dr. Heidi Tworek, who's an assistant professor of international history at the University of British Columbia and a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, as well as the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Great to talk to you today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit, maybe just to establish some of the terms we're going to be using. When we talk about public opinion and published opinion and how we should be thinking about those two concepts and how they differ, what are we talking about? Published opinion and public opinion.
So this is one of the really basic distinctions that I make in the book that I've just published. Is so often political or economic elites think that what's published in a newspaper or today what's said on TV is public opinion, what everybody thinks. And what I would say instead is that's actually published opinion, which is what a certain set of journalists and other people have produced. Public opinion, by contrast, is sort of aggregate of all the things that people think in a population. And we have to be careful not to think that the American public has one public opinion. So part of what I talk about is how this often gets misunderstood, and leaders actually think that something is public opinion that is actually published opinion.
It seems that this is a distinction that goes back, I mean, I guess maybe to telegraphy, right? In the sense that there was a point at which you, as an individual existing in the world, were hearing about what people believed from those people. It really depended on the conversations that you were having with the so-called public. And at a certain point, it became possible to put some other sort of opinion in the hands of those who have access to the means of communication and communicate more quickly than an individual might be able to with someone else. Is that sort of the origins of when public and published opinion started to separate?
To a certain extent. I mean, newspapers as a genre, so printed forms of news, they begin much earlier, so really in the 16th century, but they don't become very dominant until the 19th century. So it's really with industrialization that we see the rise of the mass urban newspaper. And those are moments that are very tied to things like telegraphy, where you can send news across the Atlantic so much faster. And there are particular newspapers, or especially news agencies, firms that emerge that are basically just doing the job of collecting news from around the world and sending it through telegraphy for other newspapers to print. So a lot of what I've written about is the power of these news agencies. So some of them still exist today, like Reuters or the Associated Press, and they really emerge in the mid-19th century, about the same time as telegraphy, and they become really important bottlenecks of global news. There are very few newspapers that have foreign correspondents or anything else, but most of the people who are reading newspapers didn't really know what news agencies were. So you start to see sort of industrial division of labor, where just a few companies are really controlling the sorts of national and international news that the vast majority of people who are buying newspapers will read.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. So I guess what I was not, in thinking of newspapers as predating telegraphy, the distribution of those newspapers was still happening much more slowly. It depended on someone bringing the newspaper, but you're absolutely right that does, of course, predate telegraphy. To go to the early 20th century and the use of some of these mass communication methods, published opinion, to use published opinion to influence public opinion. Maybe in Germany we could even talk about. What are some of the important sort of data points or milestones in the way that this was used to government's advantage?
Yeah, so this really changes quite substantially over the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. So at first, there are lots of newspapers, but it takes until even the 1890s when scholars start to say, hang on a moment, we should know how many newspapers there are and how many people are reading them and whether this intersects with voting patterns at all. So it begins really with just things like press clippings. So you'll see if you go into archives, and this is true in Germany, but also in other countries, just collections of press clippings about certain themes. And that gets taken as a kind of proxy for public opinion. So we've seen what the conservative newspaper says and what the liberal newspaper says and the more Marxist newspaper. And that's taken to just represent public opinion. So that means that government elites try to intervene in what newspapers are publishing. thinking that will then influence public opinion. And what we see then after World War I, particularly, is the growth of much more interest in more rigorous studies of public opinion, partly because journalists get uncomfortable with the fact that they've been so involved with propaganda during World War I. They and the newly emergent journalism studies or newspaper studies start to reflect on what's the actual relationship between these two things? Can we measure it more statistically? Can we do surveys to try to understand what people actually think once they've read the newspaper? And that by the sort of mid 20th century starts to emerge into public opinion surveys, things like Gallup, the sorts of techniques that we're much more used to today.
What change was there after the initial sort of era we're talking about in the early 20th century that maybe didn't serve as a reset, but that was sort of the next major shift in how public opinion and published opinion need to be considered and evaluated separately? Was it a technological change that took place and shifted us into the next phase? Or was it something else in terms of the relationships between some of these wire services and governments, or, something else altogether?
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important, you're right, is developments of new technology. And one of the things I talk about in this book is that we often mistakenly see technology as something that's sort of autonomous, but actually you can see with the Germans that they become really interested in information, particularly around 1900, and they start to see it as a way to exert global power. I mean, it's a bit like they see information not as soft power, but as a way of achieving hard power. And one of the things they do at the same time, the German government, for example, is to invest in a new technology that's known as wireless telegraphy. So it's basically sending telegrams through the air using electrical signals. And the German government subsidizes private companies to do research and development into this new technology, really driven by this political vision that you should be able to spread news around the world and bypass telegraphy and submarine cables that many Germans fear are controlled by the British. So you can see as this technology develops over the first few decades of the 20th century and accelerated by what happens during World War I, that this technology becomes something that we call a one-to-many technology. So that means you have one wireless tower and then it's sending to many, many wireless devices. And that wasn't how it was originally conceived as a technology. It was conceived like telegraphy, which was one cable here, ending cable there. And so what you can show is, okay, this technology is developing because of political and economic visions of what news should be, and eventually that will morph into spoken radio as well.
Can you talk a little bit about how the increased restriction within Germany in exactly the ways that you talk about in sort of the post-World War I era actually allowed or maybe even eased the way in which the Nazi regime was able to take over the communications within the country?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much terrible irony to a lot of the history that I talk about, because obviously after World War I, Germany becomes a democracy, but it's a pretty febrile one. There are lots of political uprisings, both on the far left and on the far right. And this is also the moment when spoken radio emerges in the early 1920s. And one bureaucrat, Hans Bredow, is charged with figuring out how should we regulate this industry. And he thinks radio is a great opportunity. It's a way that we can bring together this population. We can give people who are tired entertainment, classical music. We can uplift them through educational programs. But we need to have some state supervision of what's going on here, because we don't want to have too much news, because news might inspire more political uprisings. And as the Weimar Republic goes on, political unrest continues. There will be multiple radio reforms pushed by people like Bredow, who say, okay, we actually need more state supervision over this content because it's a way to actually preserve democracy, because we can stop news from sowing further divisions in the population. So there are a couple of radio reforms, and what that means is there's essentially state supervision of content by the time the Nazis come to power. So that ironically, these measures that were meant to save democracy, they mean that when the Nazis come to power, immediately they have control of radio content. So there's this moment in August of 1933, about 7 months after the Nazis come to power, where Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, says, the Nazis couldn't have come to power and held it like they did without the airplane and the radio. And the airplane was something that made Hitler seem very modern because he flies around and gives lots of speeches, so that helps him come to power. But it's the radio that helps the Nazis really secure their position and establish an authoritarian dictatorship.
It seems that there's this interesting analogy between the use of communications technology for propagandizing and the possibility that any technology can also be intercepted or manipulated. So, like from the IT side, there's always this idea that every time there's a new technology, with it come new ways of possibly interfering, hacking, whatever the case may be, even back to like using drums in Africa to communicate from one village to another, whether or not some rival village was coming, those drum signals could also be intercepted and manipulated. In the sort of same way, it seems that with every new communication technology came ways in which it could and was used for propaganda purposes in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing that we can see, even building on top of that, is that there are quite similar rhetorics around new technologies, which even brings us up to the internet today. So you can see with radio, for example, initially there's sort of utopian rhetoric. It's going to be the savior of the nation. That's true in Germany, in Britain, in the US as well. It's going to bring people together. It's going to make a community out of these fractured societies where industrialization has sort of pulled people apart. So initially it's really utopian rhetoric about what radio can do. And then in the 1930s, when Mussolini in Italy or Hitler in Germany are using radio to try and broadcast fascist propaganda within their countries and also outside of it, now radio seems to be a tool of demagogues and dictators. So we see this sort of move from utopian hopes into dystopian nightmares, and then often settling somewhere in between, a recognition that this technology is neither our savior nor is it our devil. It's what we as humans make of it that matters most.
Is there or are there ways in which the sort of role and positioning of Fox News in the United States today have parallels or analogs to what you talk about in the book from the early 20th century?
So there is some analog, I think. So there's one right-wing media magnate, a man called Alfred Hugenberg, who creates a whole vertically integrated media empire. So he has everything from the paper companies that are manufacturing the paper for his newspapers, advertising agencies, his own news agency, and then he also ends up buying the biggest film company in Weimar, Germany, which was a very big film industry at that point, the one that made films like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, for example. And Hugenberg's company does bear some resemblances to Fox in the sense that he basically asks his editors to push what he calls a sort of nationalist point of view, something that's more autarkic. He has a particular political party that he supports, but he doesn't want the editors to necessarily just support that party, but just have a particular point of view. And ironically, what ends up happening is the amount of support for his right-wing party drops, but much more support is created for Hitler. So he's sort of outmaneuvered in many ways because people don't vote as his newspapers tell them to. They actually vote further to the right. And I think there are some parallels to the way that Fox supported certain candidates in the primaries for the 2016 election. Then it ends up being Donald Trump who actually gets the vote, who's not necessarily the candidate putting forward the views that Fox News would have represented at that point, but then Fox also makes its accommodations with Trump.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've been reminding my audience that early in the 2016 primary, Fox was actually not behind Donald Trump. Yeah. And in fact, there were some pretty high profile conflicts between Trump and Fox News. At a certain point, and I don't know if it's when Fox realized that Trump had the momentum or what exactly pushed it over the edge, Fox did become very pro-Trump and sort of got to where it was over the last couple of years. But I also believe that if the continued polling trouble is very visible for Donald Trump, and it seems as though he might lose in 2020, I don't think Fox News will necessarily stick with him. I mean, they are decidedly right-wing, and their funders impose that they must continue to push a right-wing agenda. But I don't actually think that it's about Donald Trump specifically, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that change.
Right, and it's also about bottom lines. I mean, it is a commercial
profit
television, right? It's for profit, and if your advertisers are withdrawing their support, and I think that actually brings us right back to the beginning of our conversation about published versus public opinion. So, opinion polls are taken as the main sort of proxy for public opinion, and if those fall below a certain point, and if Fox sees its viewership drop and the number of advertisers drop, that could certainly lead to different perspectives being shown on Fox. Now, moving away from being right-wing, I doubt it, But changing some of those perspectives, I think it's not impossible. And you're quite right to remind people of that 2016 moment where Fox makes certain decisions and doesn't necessarily support Trump wholeheartedly at all. When you look back at the earlier broadcast, they were pushing other candidates like Ted Cruz.
A lot of what we've been discussing today is from the book News from Germany, The Competition to Control World Communications 1900 to 1945. We've, of course, been speaking with the book's author, Dr. Heidi Tworek, who's an assistant professor of international history at the University of British Columbia. Heidi, so great to talk to you today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me, David.